The Middle Ages, that vast and fascinating period stretching from the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century to the dawn of the Renaissance in the 15th century, is a historical tapestry woven with threads of heroism, superstition, ingenuity, contradictions, and a humanity that resonates even in our modern era. It's an age that conjures vivid images: knights in gleaming armor riding into battle, villages shrouded in morning mist, castles rising like stone sentinels, and tales of dragons, witches, saints, and monsters that seem plucked from a fevered dream or a Gothic nightmare. But what's most striking is how many of the myths, beliefs, practices, and curiosities from that time have not only survived the centuries but continue to shape our superstitions, expressions, traditions, and even popular culture. Let's dive into this world of minstrels, plagues, swords, illuminated manuscripts, and bustling markets, unraveling the myths that persist and the curiosities that make us look at the Middle Ages with a mix of awe, skepticism, and a knowing smile. If this journey into the past captivates you, subscribe to our YouTube channel to catch more stories like this. One of the most entrenched myths about the Middle Ages is the belief that everyone, from kings to peasants, thought the earth was flat. This cliché, which pops up in memes, movies, TV shows, and casual conversations, is one of those ideas that has wormed its way into our collective perception as if it were an absolute truth. However, the reality is far more complex and nuanced. While the medieval worldview was deeply steeped in religion, many scholars of the time, particularly clerics, monks, and academics, knew the earth was spherical. Figures like Isidore of Seville in the 7th century and Bede the Venerable in the 8th century described the earth as a sphere or globe in their writings, drawing on Greco-Roman texts by Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Pliny the Elder, which were never entirely lost in Europe thanks to the work of monasteries. For instance, in his work Etymologies, Isidore of Seville not only affirmed that the earth was round but also attempted to explain the movements of the stars and the distribution of continents, albeit with the scientific limitations of his time. In monasteries, the main centers of knowledge during the early Middle Ages, the shape of the world was discussed with a level of sophistication that would surprise those who view the Middle Ages as an era of total ignorance. Even in cathedral schools and the first universities, such as those in Bologna and Paris, students debated astronomy and geography, often using diagrams depicting the Earth as a sphere surrounded by the orbits of the planets. However, this knowledge was confined to educated circles: monks, clerics, and educated nobles. For the average peasant, who spent their days plowing fields, tending livestock, or paying tribute to the feudal lord, the shape of the world was irrelevant compared to more immediate concerns like the next harvest, the weather, or the threat of bandits. The myth of the flat earth gained traction in the 19th century when some historians, with an air of modern superiority, portrayed medieval people as ignorant to highlight the achievements of the Enlightenment and Renaissance. Authors like Washington Irving, in his biography of Christopher Columbus, exaggerated this idea to dramatize the navigator's challenges, creating a narrative that has endured. This caricature persists, fueled by the perception that the Middle Ages were a dark age of total ignorance, when in reality, it was a period of significant advancements in fields like scholastic philosophy, Gothic architecture, agriculture, and the preservation of classical knowledge, which laid the foundations for the modern world. Speaking of architecture, medieval castles are another subject shrouded in a haze of myths and romanticization. The popular image paints them as impregnable fortresses, surrounded by moats filled with hungry crocodiles or turbulent waters, with drawbridges raised at the slightest sign of danger and knights defending the battlements with gleaming swords and taut bows. But the reality is less cinematic and more practical. Many castles, especially in the early Middle Ages, were more fortified residences than military strongholds designed to withstand epic sieges. Initially built from wood and later from stone, castles served multiple purposes. They were administrative centers, noble residences, storage for provisions, and, only when necessary, defensive fortifications. Moats, for example, were not always filled with water. Many were dry moats, ditches designed to hinder attackers, prevent the use of siege machines like mobile towers, or collect debris during an assault. And the crocodile thing? Pure Hollywood fantasy, though it wouldn't be surprising if some eccentric noble tried importing exotic animals like leopards or peacocks to impress guests or project power. Castles were, above all, symbols of status, and their construction could take decades, even centuries, depending on available resources and the lord's ambitions. A curious fact: Dover Castle in England, one of Europe's most iconic, incorporated Roman techniques, such as stone walls reinforced with layers of flint, showing that medieval builders weren't as primitive as they're sometimes portrayed. These buildings, with their towers, battlements, inner courtyards, and walls, were true feats of engineering, designed not only for defense but also to project authority, wealth, and prestige. Towers, for instance, weren't always purely defensive. In many cases, they served as lookout points for nobles to survey their lands, welcome guests with stunning views, or even host banquets at great heights. Castles also featured ingenious systems, like internal wells to ensure water supply during sieges or murder holes, openings in the walls through which stones, hot oil, or even manure could be dropped on attackers. Today, castles continue to capture our imagination, from the ruins we visit as tourists in places like Scotland or the Loire Valley to the fictional versions in video games like Assassin's Creed, TV shows like Game of Thrones, or movies like The Lord of the Rings. Their image of power and mystery is a direct legacy of the Middle Ages, but also a reminder that their function was as practical as it was symbolic. Another persistent myth is about medieval hygiene, or rather, the supposed complete lack of it. The popular image is of a population that rarely bathed, living in cities that smelled like medieval landfills, with muddy streets and waste tossed out windows without a second thought. There's some truth to this, but it's exaggerated to the point of absurdity, and the reality is far more nuanced. It's true that hygiene standards weren't what they are today, and access to clean water was a challenge, especially in densely populated cities where rivers like the Thames in London or the Seine in Paris were often polluted with human, animal, and industrial waste. However, public bathhouses, known as stews or steam baths, were surprisingly common in many European cities, particularly in the south, where Roman and Arab traditions left a deep mark. In Al-Andalus, for example, cities like Granada or Cordoba had public baths, hammams, that were social hubs where people not only cleaned themselves but also conversed, conducted business, or relaxed. This practice spread to other parts of Europe, and in cities like Florence or Bruges, bathhouses were a thriving business, frequented by merchants, artisans, and even clerics. In monasteries, monks followed strict cleanliness rules, not just for hygiene but as part of their spiritual discipline, bathing regularly and keeping their habits clean. Nobles, meanwhile, bathed in wooden tubs with heated water, often scented with herbs like lavender, rosemary, or rose petals for a touch of luxury. These tubs could be moved from room to room, and in wealthier courts, baths were a social event, with servants heating the water and musicians playing for entertainment. The idea of tossing buckets of waste out windows, while not entirely false, wasn't as universal as believed. In many cities, like London, Paris, or Toledo, there were municipal regulations to prevent this practice, and specific sites, like communal pits or rivers outside the city, were designated for waste disposal. However, these rules weren't always followed, especially in poorer neighborhoods with limited infrastructure. A curious fact: in medieval England, there was a trade known as gong firmers, or latrine cleaners, who were tasked with emptying city septic pits, a job as unpleasant as it was vital for maintaining a minimum of sanitary order. In some cities, like York, these cleaners had organized guilds, and their work was so valued that they could earn more than the average artisan. So, while medieval people weren't obsessed with daily showers or deodorants, they didn't live in a swamp of filth as sometimes imagined. This myth persists partly because we like to think our modernity is infinitely superior, but the truth is that medieval people did the best they could with the resources of their time, and in many cases, their hygiene practices were more advanced than we assume. And if you want to dive deeper into this topic, I've left a book recommendation in the description. The Black Death, that devastating pandemic that swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351, killing millions and leaving an indelible scar on history, is another topic surrounded by myths, curiosities, and misunderstandings. One of the most persistent is the belief that cats were blamed for spreading the disease, leading to mass feline slaughters in some regions. While this idea isn't universally documented, it has some basis. In certain places, Cats were associated with the devil, witchcraft, or malevolent forces, making them scapegoats during the plague's panic. For example, in some French and German cities, cat massacres were organized as part of rituals to purify the community. Ironically, this practice worsened the situation, as cats helped control the rat population, the true carriers of fleas infected with the Yersinia pestis bacterium. This myth has left a lasting mark on modern superstitions about black cats bringing bad luck, a belief that still makes some people avoid crossing paths with a dark feline in an alley. Another iconic image of the plague that continues to fascinate is the figure of the plague doctor, with their beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs, looking like something out of a gothic horror film or a Halloween costume. These beak masks had a logic. Doctors believed the plague spread through miasmas or bad air, and the herbs, like rosemary, thyme, or cloves, were thought to filter these airs and protect the wearer. Spoiler: they weren't very effective against a flea-borne bacterium, but the design was a reasonable attempt for the time, based on the available medical theories. A curious fact: during the plague, some towns implemented strict quarantines, isolating the sick in their homes, marked with red crosses, or in makeshift hospitals outside the city walls. The word quarantine comes from the Italian 40 giorni. The 40 days ships had to wait in port before disembarking to prevent disease spread. This practice, though rudimentary, shows that medieval people weren't entirely ignorant about epidemic control, and some of their measures, like isolation, foreshadow modern protocols. The plague also left a profound cultural impact. It inspired artworks like the Dance of Death, depicting skeletons leading rich and poor alike to the afterlife, and literature like Boccaccio's Decameron, where a group of youths tell stories to escape the horror of the pandemic. Today, the Black Death lives on in our culture, from plague doctor costumes at Halloween to references in video games like Plague Incorporated or series like The Last Kingdom, which capture the terror and desperation of the era. Witches, another cornerstone of medieval imagery, are a topic that can't be overlooked when discussing myths and curiosities. The stereotypical image of a witch with a pointed hat, warts, flying broom, and steaming cauldron is a modern construct, largely popularized by 19th and 20th century literature and cinema. However, its roots lie in the Middle Ages, though the reality is more complex than it seems. Contrary to popular belief, the Great Witch Hunts, with their mass trials and burnings, occurred mainly in the early modern period, between the 16th and 17th centuries, during the height of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, when moral panic peaked. In the Middle Ages, which persecution was more sporadic, and the seeds of this fear were planted in the late Middle Ages, particularly from the 13th century, when the Church began associating certain popular practices, like herbalism, peasant rituals, or residual pagan beliefs, with the devil. Healers, women who used herbs to treat illnesses, assist in childbirth, or alleviate pain, were particularly vulnerable to accusations, especially if they were solitary, elderly, widowed, or didn't fit into the community's social norms. A curious myth is that of flying witches. In texts like the Canon Episcopi, a 10th century ecclesiastical document, women were described as supposedly flying on brooms, sticks, or animals at night to meet demons in sabbats, gatherings where they allegedly worshipped the devil. Interestingly, the Church initially considered these stories pagan superstitions, not real events, urging the faithful not to believe or spread them. For example, the Canon Episcopi declared that these visions were illusions induced by the devil, not physical realities, and believing in them was a form of heresy. Over time, however, these ideas turned into serious accusations, especially from the 15th century, when texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, published in 1486, codified the fear of witchcraft and provided a guide for identifying, interrogating, and punishing alleged witches. This shift in perception fueled later witch trials, but in the Middle Ages, persecution was more localized, often driven by personal disputes, envy, or social crises like bad harvests or epidemics. A curious fact: in some cases, witchcraft accusations targeted men, such as sorcerers practicing alchemy or astrology, though women were the most common targets due to gender biases. Today, the witch remains a powerful cultural symbol, from Halloween decorations to characters in series like Sabrina, the Teenage Witch or The Witcher, but their origin is a reminder of how fear of the other, combined with religious fervor and social tensions, can distort reality and lead to tragic consequences. Knights and their supposed code of chivalry are another topic wrapped in a romantic aura that doesn't always reflect reality. The image of the noble knight, defender of damsels, orphans, justice, and faith, is more a literary ideal than a universal truth. In practice, many knights were mercenaries, feudal lords, or soldiers who used their status to maintain power, enrich themselves, or settle personal debts. The code of chivalry, popularized by troubadours and writers like Chrétien de Troyes in his 12th century Arthurian romances, such as Lancelot or Yvain, was more an aspiration than a strict rule. This code urged knights to be loyal, brave, pious, and courteous, but in reality, betrayals, vendettas, looting, and political interests were common. For example, during the Crusades, many knights joined not only for faith but for the promise of land, spoils, or prestige. Medieval tournaments, which we now imagine as elegant events with justs, cheering ladies, and heralds announcing contenders, were often chaotic, violent, and dangerous. In the early Middle Ages, tournaments were more like mass battles, known as melees, where dozens of knights fought in an open field, sometimes with fatal consequences or serious injuries. Even in the more organized tournaments of the late Middle Ages, knights could die or be crippled, and the events were sometimes excuses to settle personal scores or gain social prestige. A curious fact: in some tournaments, knights wore heavier, less practical decorative armor than combat armor, just to impress the crowd with their wealth and style, featuring engravings, gilding, or even velvet capes. This contrast between the heroic myth and pragmatic reality continues to inspire our culture, from 15th-century chivalric novels like Amadis de Gaula to Hollywood films like King Arthur, Excalibur, or Kingdom of Heaven, which romanticize knights while ignoring their more earthly motivations. The Crusades, those religious expeditions that marked the Middle Ages between the 11th and 13th centuries, are also surrounded by myths and misunderstandings. They're often seen as purely spiritual wars, motivated by faith and the desire to liberate the Holy Land from Muslims. However, the motives were often more complex and worldly. Political power, wealth, control of trade routes, land, and prestige. The Crusades didn't just pit Christians against Muslims. They also included internal conflicts, like the Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204, which ended with the sack of Constantinople, a Christian city, by Crusaders, an event that shocked even contemporaries. A curious myth is that of the Children's Crusade of 1212, which supposedly involved thousands of children marching to Jerusalem, convinced their purity would allow them to liberate it without weapons. The reality is less romantic and more tragic. It was likely a disorganized movement of poor youths, peasants, and outcasts, manipulated by charismatic preachers exploiting the religious fervor of the time. Many of these crusaders ended up sold into slavery in Mediterranean ports, lost on the way, or dead from hunger and exhaustion, with no evidence they reached the Holy Land. This story, though exaggerated by legend, reflects how faith, desperation, and fervor could mobilize masses, especially in a period of economic and social crisis. A curious fact: Crusaders often wore crosses sewn onto their clothing as a symbol of their vow, and these crosses were so important that some kept them even after returning, like a badge of honor. Today, the Crusades remain a symbol of cultural conflict, though their historical complexity is often lost in simplistic narratives that paint them as a clash of civilizations, ignoring the economic, political, and personal motivations behind them. Dragons, those mythical creatures populating medieval tales, bestiaries, and legends, are another example of how the era's imagination lives on in our culture. In medieval Europe, dragons were symbols of chaos, evil, or untamed power, often defeated by saints like Saint George, Saint Michael, or legendary heroes like Siegfried in the Nibelungenlied. Some historians suggest dragon stories may have been inspired by dinosaur or large reptile fossils found by peasants, interpreted as remains of mythical monsters. For example, in some European regions, like the Alps, fossils of ammonites or prehistoric mammal bones could have fueled these tales. Others believe dragons were a way to explain inexplicable natural phenomena, like volcanic eruptions, storms, comets, or even auroras, interpreted as fire in the sky. A curious fact: medieval bestiaries, illustrated books describing real and fantastical animals depicted dragons with such detail: bat-like wings, fiery breath, impenetrable scales, and tails capable of toppling trees or crushing armies, that they seemed real. For instance, the Physiologus, an influential Christian text from the 2nd century popularized in the Middle Ages, described the dragon as an enemy of the elephant, a metaphor for the struggle between good and evil, with the elephant representing virtue and the dragon sin. Some bestiaries claimed dragons lived in caves in Ethiopia or India, regions medieval people considered exotic and full of wonders. This mix of fear, fascination, and symbolism lives on in our culture, from fantasy sagas like The Lord of the Rings, where Smaug is a feared yet charismatic dragon, to Game of Thrones, where Daenerys's dragons are allies and symbols of power, or video games like Skyrim, where dragons are both enemies and mythical figures. The transformation of dragons from feared monsters to admired creatures shows how medieval myths have evolved but never disappeared. And if you want to learn more, check out the book recommendation in the description. Another persistent myth is that of the Dark Ages, the idea that the Middle Ages were a period of ignorance, violence, and intellectual stagnation, a kind of dark parenthesis between the glory of Rome and the splendor of the Renaissance. This view, promoted by Renaissance and Enlightenment thinkers like Petrarch or Voltaire, who wanted to highlight their own intellectual light, is an unfair simplification that ignores the era's many achievements. In agriculture, for example, the introduction of the heavy plow, three-field crop rotation, and the use of water and windmills revolutionized food production, enabling a growing population and laying the groundwork for Europe's demographic growth. These innovations not only boosted productivity but also freed up labor for other activities, like trade and craftsmanship. Universities, like Bologna, founded in 1088, Paris, circa 1150, and Oxford, circa 1096, were cradles of modern thought, training students in theology, law, medicine, and the liberal arts, which included grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These institutions not only preserved classical knowledge but also fostered philosophical and scientific debates that anticipated the scientific method. For example, thinkers like Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century combined Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology, creating scholasticism, a system of thought that sought to reconcile faith and reason. Illuminated manuscripts, with their intricate designs and vibrant colors, are a testament to the era's artistic talent, comparable to any later period. These manuscripts, produced in monastery scriptoria, contained not only religious texts but also works of literature, science, and law, like Isidore's Etymologies or Peter Lombard's Sentences. A curious fact: monks copying texts, often in uncomfortable conditions, sometimes left notes in the margins complaining about the cold, fatigue, poor lighting, or even the monastery's bland food. A famous note, found in a 9th century manuscript, reads, "Thank God, it will soon be dark, and I can rest my hands." These annotations reveal a human, even humorous side that debunks the image of a grim, rigid era. Yet the Dark Ages myth persists, partly because it's a convenient narrative to highlight modernity's achievements, but also because the Middle Ages were a period of contrasts, with moments of great violence, like Viking invasions or feudal wars, and others of profound ingenuity, like the construction of Gothic cathedrals or the development of musical notation. Medieval superstitions are another endless source of curiosities that still echo in our daily lives. Knocking on wood to ward off bad luck, for instance, has roots in pagan beliefs associating trees with protective spirits, an idea Christianized in the Middle Ages when people began touching wooden crosses or altars to invoke divine protection. The fear of the number 13, linked to the Last Supper, where Judas was the 13th guest, remains so strong that many modern buildings skip the 13th floor in elevators, and some airlines avoid using the number 13 in their seat rows. Broken mirrors, considered bad luck, were feared in the Middle Ages because it was believed the soul could get trapped in the fragments, and since mirrors were expensive and rare, breaking one was both a financial and spiritual misfortune. A curious fact: in some villages, horseshoes were hung on doors to ward off evil spirits, a practice still seen in rustic decorations or modern amulets. Another curious superstition was the belief that a wolf howling under the moon could predict disaster, like a death or storm, leading some communities to perform rituals to keep wolves at bay, like lighting bonfires, ringing bells, or hanging amulets in stables. In some regions, it was believed that an iron ring, especially if blessed, could protect against demons, and many people, from peasants to nobles, wore them as amulets. Church bells also played a special role. Beyond announcing important events like births, weddings, or deaths, they were rung to protect against storms, evil spirits, or even the plague, a practice known as ringing against storms. In some villages, specific storm bells were used during tempests to disperse clouds or ward off demons believed to cause them. These beliefs, which today seem quaint or even absurd, were taken seriously in a world where the supernatural and the everyday were deeply intertwined, and many of these practices have left traces in our traditions, like the use of amulets, superstitions about animals, or customs tied to certain numbers or gestures. If you're enjoying this dive into the Middle Ages, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more historical content with a touch of humor. Relics, sacred objects like bones, locks of hair, teeth, or even fragments of saints' clothing, were venerated in the Middle Ages for their supposed ability to work miracles, heal diseases, or protect entire communities. Churches, cathedrals, and monasteries competed to possess the most prestigious relics, which attracted pilgrims from across Europe, bringing donations, trade, and prestige. For example, the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela became a major pilgrimage destination thanks to the supposed relics of the Apostle James, while the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris was built specifically to house Christ's crown of thorns. However, the relic market was ripe for fraud, and the proliferation of fake relics was a known issue even at the time. It was said there were enough splinters of the true cross to build a cathedral, a ship, or even an entire forest, according to the more cynical critics. A curious fact: some relics were so bizarre they defy imagination, like the milk of the Virgin Mary, the foreskin of Christ, or the feathers of the Archangel Gabriel, sold at exorbitant prices to credulous churches and nobles. In some cases, clerics themselves were skeptical about certain relics' authenticity but promoted them because they strengthened the faith of the devout, attracted pilgrims, and filled church coffers. For example, in the 12th century, Abbot Suger of St. Denis defended the authenticity of his monastery's relics but also acknowledged their value lay more in their spiritual significance than their historical veracity. This trade, though sometimes fraudulent, reflects the era's deep spirituality and the need for tangible connections to the divine in a world full of uncertainty. Today, the fascination with relics persists, albeit differently. From magical objects in video games like the Elder Scrolls to fictional relics in movies like Indiana Jones and the Lost Ark, the idea of an object with special powers continues to capture our imagination. Medieval food is another topic surrounded by myths and stereotypes. The popular image is of nobles at lavish banquets, with tables overflowing with roasted meats, exotic birds, spilling wine, and musicians playing lutes or flutes in the background. While noble banquets could be extravagant, especially in the courts of kings or dukes, with spectacular dishes like roasted peacocks adorned with their feathers, stuffed swans, or pies filled with live birds that flew out when cut, the diet of most of the population was far more modest. Peasants, who made up over 90% of the population, lived on bread, porridge, legumes, vegetables like cabbage or turnips, and some cheese or salted fish, with meat as a luxury reserved for festivities like Christmas, Easter, or weddings. Bread, the staple of the diet, wasn't always the white, fluffy loaf we imagine. In times of scarcity, it was mixed with rye, barley, or even ground acorns, creating a hard, unappetizing loaf. A curious fact: spices like pepper, saffron, cloves, or cinnamon were worth more than gold due to their rarity and the cost of importing them from Asia or Africa through trade routes like those of Venice or Genoa. The wealthy not only used spices in cooking but also to flaunt status, sometimes sprinkling them on tables or mixing them into drinks to impress guests. Religious rules also shaped diets. Fasting days, which could account for up to a third of the year in the liturgical calendar, prohibited meat, leading medieval people to rely on fish, cheese, eggs, or legumes. In monasteries, monks developed ingenious recipes, like almond milk made from ground almonds, to replace cow's milk on fasting days. This culinary creativity, combined with the need to make use of every resource, shows that medieval food was more varied and complex than myths suggest. Today, this fascination with medieval food is reflected in historical festivals, where banquets are recreated with period recipes, or in restaurants serving medieval dishes, like thick soups or roasted meats with exotic spices. Medieval armor is another topic full of misunderstandings and myths. The popular belief is that armor was so heavy that knights could barely move, becoming like turtles on their backs if they fell, unable to get up without help. In reality, plate armor from the 15th century, the most advanced of the Middle Ages, weighed between 20 and 25 kilos, not much more than the gear of a modern soldier with a bulletproof vest and backpack. These armors, made of tempered steel, were designed with ingenious joints that allowed surprising flexibility, enabling knights to ride horses, wield swords, climb ladders, or even perform acrobatics. Knights trained from a young age, often from 7 or 8 as pages or squires, to move agilely in armor, and tournaments were a chance to showcase this skill. A curious fact: in some tournaments, knights performed impressive feats, like jumping onto their horses or running in armor, to impress the crowd and debunk the idea that they were clumsy. Armor was also a work of art, especially for wealthy nobles, who might decorate it with engravings, gilding, precious metal inlays, or even velvet capes embroidered with gold thread. For example, the tournament armor of Henry VIII of England, preserved in museums, shows a level of craftsmanship rivaling modern haute couture. So, the next time you see a movie where a knight is trapped in their armor, have a laugh. Reality was far more dynamic and sophisticated. This myth persists partly because display armors in museums are often heavier and less practical than combat armor, fueling the idea that they were cumbersome. Medieval medicine, though rudimentary compared to today's, had its own merits and advances, often overlooked. Doctors relied on classical texts by Hippocrates and Galen, preserved and expanded through Arabic translations by figures like Avicenna, whose canon of medicine was a cornerstone in universities like Salerno, Montpellier, or Paris. Practices like bloodletting, which involved drawing blood to balance the humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, according to humoral theory, often did more harm than good, but in rare cases could relieve conditions like hypertension or fever. However, the overuse of bloodletting, sometimes with dirty lancets, caused infections and worsened patients' health. A curious fact: barbers, besides cutting hair and shaving beards, performed minor surgeries like tooth extractions, abscess drainage, or even amputations, giving rise to the barber's pole with its red, blood, and white bandages, stripes, a symbol still seen in modern barbershops. Surgery, without modern anesthesia, was brutal, with patients often tied down or given wine to dull the pain. Yet medieval surgeons developed ingenious techniques, like using wine or vinegar as antiseptics, linen thread for sutures, or herbs like mandrake, believed to have narcotic properties, though its use was risky and could be deadly. In monastic hospitals, monks combined medical care with prayer, treating patients with special diets, warm baths, and herbal poultices. For example, Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century nun, wrote medical treatises blending empirical observations with spirituality, recommending plants like fennel or sage for various ailments. This contrast between the primitive and the innovative shows that medieval medicine, though limited by technology and knowledge, wasn't just a parade of butchers but a field in constant evolution. Mythical beasts, beyond dragons, also fueled the medieval imagination and left a lasting legacy. The unicorn, described in bestiaries as a real animal, was a symbol of purity and grace, believed to be capturable only by a virgin, blending Christian symbolism with pagan fantasy. Unicorn horns, actually narwhal tusks imported from the Arctic, were sold at exorbitant prices as miraculous remedies for poisons or diseases. For example, in royal courts, horns were used to test food for poison, reflecting both the era's paranoia and fascination with the exotic. The basilisk, a monster half-cock, half-serpent, was said to kill with its gaze or venomous breath, supposedly born from a chicken egg incubated by a snake. This creature, described in bestiaries like the Liber Monstrorum, reflects medieval fears of the unknown and the need to explain strange natural phenomena. A curious fact: bestiaries didn't just describe fantastical creatures but assigned moral meanings. For example, the pelican, believed to feed its young with its own blood, was a symbol of Christ's sacrifice. Other creatures, like the griffin, half-lion, half-eagle, or the phoenix, reborn from its ashes, were metaphors for power, resurrection, or immortality. These creatures, though imaginary, show how medieval people tried to make sense of a mysterious world, from strange fossils to travelers' tales, and their influence lives on in our culture, from brand logos to monsters in video games like Monster Hunter. Medieval justice, with its trials by ordeal, is another topic that both fascinates and horrifies. Practices like submerging a person in water to determine guilt. If they floated, they were guilty, as water rejected sinners. If they sank, they were innocent, though sometimes drowned, or making someone walk over burning coals existed, but they weren't as common as believed. Ordeals, like trial by fire, water, or combat, were a last resort when evidence was lacking, based on the belief that God would intervene to reveal the truth. However, the Church began discouraging them from the 13th century, especially after the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which banned clerics from participating, favoring more rational methods like sworn testimonies or documented evidence. A curious fact, ordeals were often more theatrical than practical, designed to scare the accused into confessing before reaching the extreme. For example, in some cases, the water for trial by water was blessed, adding psychological intimidation. In other cases, judicial duels, where two parties fought to prove their innocence, could involve professional champions hired by wealthy defendants, turning justice into a spectacle. This image of barbaric justice persists, though reality was more complex, with feudal, ecclesiastical, and municipal courts striving to maintain order in a fragmented society where laws varied from place to place. Everyday life in the Middle Ages is also full of surprising details that challenge our prejudices. While life expectancy at birth was low, around 30 to 35 years, this was mainly due to high infant mortality, which could exceed 50% in some regions. Those who reached adulthood, especially in the upper classes with better nutrition and care, could live into their 60s or 70s with luck and good health. For example, historical figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who lived to 82 in the 12th century, show that longevity wasn't impossible. Marriages, though often arranged among the nobility for political or economic alliances, could be by choice among peasants, artisans, and small merchants, and there are letters, poems, and legal documents showing genuine romantic love. For instance, the love letters of Abelard and Heloise, two 12th century figures, are a moving testament to passion in an era we often imagine as cold and calculated. A curious fact, medieval weddings included strange traditions, like the bedding ceremony, where guests escorted the newlyweds to bed, sometimes with bawdy songs and jokes, to celebrate the union and ensure its legitimacy. This custom, which today would seem invasive, was a way to reinforce community ties and ensure the marriage was consummated, especially in the upper classes, where inheritances were at stake. Religion, as expected, permeated every aspect of medieval life, from daily morality to political and social organization. The 7 deadly sins, pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth, formalized by the Church in the Middle Ages, were a guide to avoid eternal damnation and shape behavior. Sermons, religious plays, and church frescoes reminded the faithful of sin's consequences, often with vivid images of demons and infernal torments. However, the Church wasn't just a spiritual authority but also a driver of knowledge. Monasteries, especially Benedictine and Cistercian ones, were centers of learning where classical texts were preserved, historical chronicles were written, and technological innovations, like mechanical clocks or irrigation systems, were developed. A curious fact, copying monks, who spent hours transcribing texts in scriptoria, sometimes left humorous or complaining notes in the margins, like, "This parchment is too rough, my fingers are numb," or "I wish I had a beer." These marginal glosses show a human, even playful side that transcends centuries and debunks the image of a rigid, somber era. Religious festivals, like Christmas, Easter, or Carnival, were a release valve for a strict society, where social hierarchies were temporarily relaxed. During Carnival, for example, a King of Fools, or Bishop of Fools, was chosen to lead festivities, organize parades, and mock authorities, a practice that allowed the community to release tensions before Lent. A curious fact, In some regions, carnival included satirical plays, known as fool's plays, mocking nobles, clerics, or even the king, a tradition that anticipates modern satirical theater. Medieval fashion was far more than rags, coarse tunics, or armor. Clothing was a symbol of status, power, and wealth, and sumptuary laws, enacted in many cities and kingdoms, regulated who could wear certain colors, materials, or styles to maintain social hierarchies. For example, purple, derived from a rare and costly dye extracted from mollusks, was reserved for royalty and high clerics, while bright colors like scarlet or deep blue were privileges of wealthy nobles. Pointed shoes, known as polanes, could be so long, especially in the 14th century, that nobles tied them to their knees with chains to avoid tripping, an extravagant yet impractical fashion that drew criticism from the church, which deemed them frivolous and sinful. Noble women wore elaborate headdresses, like the hennin, a tall cone covered in fabric that could reach a meter in height and required the balance of a juggler. A curious fact: in some courts, ladies wore dresses with such long trains that servants were needed to carry them, a display of ostentation rivaling any modern haute couture runway. Men weren't far behind. In the 13th century, young nobles adopted padded tunics or fitted vests to appear more robust, a sort of aesthetic cheat, not unlike today's male fashion trends. In the lower classes, clothing was simpler, made of undyed wool or linen, but even peasants decorated their garments with simple embroidery or ribbons for festivities. This obsession with appearance, regulated by laws and shaped by culture, shows that medieval fashion was as complex and symbolic as ours. Medieval music, from Gregorian chants in monasteries to the love ballads of troubadours, was much more than entertainment. It was a way to convey stories, values, emotions, and news. Troubadours, poet-musicians of the nobility, popularized the concept of courtly love in the 12th and 13th centuries, singing to idealized ladies in castles of southern France or northern Italy. Their songs, like those of Bernard de Ventadorn, blended passion, devotion, and a touch of melancholy that still resonates in modern romantic music. Minstrels, on the other hand, were itinerant performers who combined music, poetry, acrobatics, and storytelling, bringing news and entertainment from village to village. A curious fact: some medieval melodies, like the Cantigas de Santa Maria by Alfonso X the Wise, a collection of over 400 religious songs from the 13th century, have survived and are performed in modern concerts, showing the longevity of medieval music. Instruments like the lute, viol, flute, harp, or organetto, a portable organ, were common in courts and town squares, and some, like the lute, have roots in Arabic instruments introduced to Europe through Al-Andalus. Gothic cathedral stained glass, meanwhile, was more than decoration. It was a visual book for a largely illiterate population, telling biblical stories, saints' lives, or moral allegories with vibrant colors and intricate details. For example, the stained glass of Chartres Cathedral, from the 13th century, narrates everything from the Virgin Mary's life to scenes of the Apocalypse, and their preservation is a testament to the era's artistic mastery. This tradition of narrative art, blending beauty and teaching, anticipates comics, graphic novels, and even modern animations. Rural life, the reality for the vast majority of the population, has its own stories and nuances that challenge the image of a miserable, oppressive existence. While peasants were tied to the feudal system, with obligations like working the lord's lands, paying tithes in goods or money, and serving in war, many had some autonomy, especially in common lands where they shared resources like pastures, forests, rivers, or beehives. These common lands, managed collectively, were a precursor to modern ideas of sustainability, community cooperation, and shared economy. Famines were a constant threat, especially in the early Middle Ages, when climate changes and poor harvests could devastate entire communities. During these times, peasants resorted to emergency foods like ground tree bark, acorns, nettles, or wild herbs, showing impressive resilience in the face of adversity. A curious fact: in some villages, animals were put on trial for causing damage, like pigs destroying crops, chickens invading gardens, or even locusts ravaging fields. These animal trials, common in France and Germany, could include a formal process with lawyers, witnesses, and sentences, and in some cases, animals were excommunicated or executed. For example, in 1457 in Savigny, France, a sow and her piglets were tried for killing a child. The sow was sentenced to death, while the piglets were pardoned due to their youth. This practice, which seems absurd today, reflected the importance of maintaining social order in communities where every resource was vital, and animal damage could threaten survival. Death, ever present in a world marked by wars, plagues, famines, and limited medicine, deeply shaped medieval culture. The Dance of Death, Danse Macabre, a popular allegory in late medieval art and literature, depicted death as a skeleton leading rich, poor, nobles, peasants, clerics, and kings alike, reminding everyone that no one escaped their fate. This image, appearing in frescoes, engravings, and poems, lives on in our fascination with the macabre, from depictions of the Grim Reaper in art to modern horror films. A curious fact: in some medieval cemeteries, especially in densely populated cities, ossuaries, or bone houses, were built to store remains when space ran out. These ossuaries, like those at Santa Maria in Lisbon or Sedlec in the modern Czech Republic, were decorated with skulls and bones, creating a practical yet macabre effect that attracted the faithful and reinforced devotion. In some funerals, especially among nobles, professional mourners were hired to weep dramatically, ensuring a theatrical farewell, a custom still seen in some traditional Mediterranean and Latin American cultures. This relationship with death, feared yet accepted as part of life, left a legacy in our culture, from skulls in Gothic art to celebrations like Mexico's Day of the Dead, blending the solemn with the festive. And if you want to learn more, check out the book recommendation in the description. To keep exploring, let's delve into lesser-known superstitions that still echo today. Beyond knocking on wood or fearing the number 13, medieval people believed certain objects, like a blessed iron ring, could protect against demons, and many, from peasants to knights, wore them as amulets. In some regions, church bells were thought to disperse storms, ward off evil spirits, or stop the plague, rung during crises to invoke divine protection. In England, for example, storm bells were common in rural churches, their sound considered a shield against supernatural forces. Wolves, feared for their impact on livestock, were also spiritual symbols of danger, and some villages performed rituals to keep them at bay, like hanging amulets in stables, lighting bonfires on full moon nights, or sacrificing an animal to appease spirits. In European folklore, wolves were often linked to the devil or werewolves, people believed to transform into wolves under a spell or demonic pact. These stories, blending fear and fascination, fed tales still seen in horror films and fantasy literature. Medieval maps, like the Hereford Mappa Mundi, circa 1300, or the Ebstorf Mappa Mundi, are another fascinating window into the era's mindset. These maps weren't just geographic tools but narrative, theological, and artistic works, filled with strange creatures like dog-headed men, cynocephaly, one-footed giants, monopods, beings with mouths on their chests, or mythical peoples like the Blemmies. These images reflected the belief that the edges of the known world, especially in Africa and Asia, were populated by wonders and dangers. Travelers' tales, like those of Marco Polo, who visited Asia in the 13th century, or John Mandeville, whose work blends fact and fantasy, fueled these ideas. For example, Polo described unicorns in Asia, likely referring to rhinoceroses, but to medieval people, these stories confirmed mythical creatures' existence. A curious fact: medieval maps often placed Jerusalem at the world's center, reflecting religion's importance in their worldview, and depicted the world as a circle divided into 3 continents: Europe, Asia, Africa, surrounded by a mythical ocean. This fascination with the exotic and unknown lives on in our culture, from J.R.R. Tolkien's fantasy stories to fictional explorations in video games like The Elder Scrolls or Horizon Zero Dawn, recreating worlds full of wonders and dangers. Medieval education, though limited compared to today's, wasn't exclusive to clerics, as sometimes thought. In cities, literacy grew among merchants, artisans, and burghers, especially from the 13th century, when trade and urbanization drove the need to read, write, and calculate. Cathedral schools, emerging in the 11th century, educated noble children and, in some cases, those from wealthy families, teaching Latin, grammar, rhetoric, and theology. Universities like Bologna, founded 1088, Paris, circa 1150, Oxford, circa 1096, and Salamanca, circa 1218, trained an intellectual elite in law, medicine, theology, and the liberal arts. These institutions not only preserved classical knowledge but also fostered philosophical and scientific debates that anticipated the scientific method. For example, Roger Bacon, a 13th-century Franciscan friar, championed empirical observation and experimentation, ideas that would be crucial in the scientific revolution centuries later. A curious fact: medieval students were notorious for rebellious behavior, and in cities like Paris, Oxford, or Bologna, clashes between students and locals were so common they sometimes ended in riots, with taverns destroyed, markets looted, and authorities overwhelmed. In 1355, for example, the St. Scholastica Day riot in Oxford left dozens dead after a dispute between students and townspeople sparked in a tavern. This image of rowdy students isn't far from some modern universities, where parties and protests are part of the experience. Medieval warfare, far from just epic battles between massive armies, included ingenious, cruel, and often psychological tactics. Catapults, though impressive in medieval illustrations, were less accurate than we imagine, and their impact relied more on the fear they inspired than their destructive power. During sieges, more common than pitched battles, attackers used machines like battering rams, mobile towers, or trebuchets to breach walls, but also resorted to unconventional tactics, like throwing dead animals, manure, or even beehives to spread disease or cause panic. A curious fact: in some sieges, defenders threw food from the walls to deceive attackers, making them believe supplies were plentiful and discouraging them. For example, during the siege of Carcassonne in 1209, defenders threw a fattened pig to convince attackers they weren't starving, a tactic that worked. These strategies show that medieval warfare was as much about cunning as brute force, and commanders like Richard the Lionheart or Saladin were admired not just for their valor but for their tactical intelligence. Medieval fashion, as mentioned, was a reflection of status but also a field of experimentation and creativity. Beyond polaines and hennin headdresses, nobles spent fortunes on imported fabrics like silk from Constantinople, linen from Flanders, or velvet from Italy, symbols of wealth and power. Sumptuary laws in cities like Venice, Florence, or London regulated who could wear certain colors, materials, or adornments, like ermine furs or jeweled embroidery, to prevent wealthy merchants from outshining nobles. A curious fact: in the 14th century, young noblemen adopted fitted jackets, known as pourpoints, that accentuated the figure and were sometimes padded to appear more muscular, a practice reminiscent of modern male beauty standards. Women used rudimentary corsets to shape their figures, and in wealthier courts, dresses could feature embroidery with gold thread or pearls imported from Asia. In the lower classes, clothing was simpler, made of undyed wool or linen, but even peasants decorated their garments with ribbons, simple embroidery, or bronze brooches for festivities, showing that fashion wasn't exclusive to the rich. Medieval music and art left a lasting legacy that still resonates. Beyond troubadours and Gregorian chants, genres like cantigas, chansons, and madrigals combined poetry and music to tell stories of love, heroism, or devotion. Minstrels, performing in squares, castles, and markets, were the era's storytellers, bringing news, gossip, and entertainment to isolated communities. A curious fact: some medieval songs, like the Carmina Burana, a 13th-century collection of poems and songs, are so energetic and exaggerated that they've inspired modern operas, films, and even advertisements. Instruments like the lute, viol, shawm, harp, or organetto were common in courts and squares, and some, like the lute, have roots in Arabic instruments introduced through Al-Andalus. Gothic cathedral stained glass, like those in Notre Dame, Chartres, or Canterbury, were more than decorations. They were educational tools for a largely illiterate population, telling biblical stories, saints' lives, or moral allegories with vibrant colors and intricate details. For example, the stained glass of Leon Cathedral in Spain narrates everything from the creation to the Last Judgment, using vivid colors and meticulous details that still awe visitors. This narrative art tradition, blending beauty, symbolism, and teaching, anticipates comics, graphic novels, animations, and even modern video games that use imagery to tell complex stories. Rural life, the reality for most of the population, has its own stories and nuances that challenge the image of a miserable, oppressive existence. While peasants were bound to the feudal system, with obligations like working the lord's lands, paying tithes in grain, livestock, or money, and serving in war, many had some autonomy, especially in common lands where they shared resources like pastures, forests, rivers, beehives, or communal ovens. These common lands, managed collectively, were a precursor to modern ideas of sustainability, community cooperation, and shared economy, surviving in some regions like England until the 18th century when enclosure acts privatized many of them. Famines were a constant threat, especially in the early Middle Ages, when climate changes, like the cooling of the Little Ice Age in the 14th century, and poor harvests could devastate communities. During these times, peasants resorted to emergency foods like ground tree bark, acorns, nettles, wild roots, or even edible clay, showing remarkable resilience. A curious fact: in some villages, animals were put on trial for causing damage, like pigs destroying crops, chickens invading gardens, goats eating orchards, or locusts ravaging fields. These animal trials, common in France, Germany, and Switzerland, could include a formal process with lawyers, witnesses, judges, and sentences, and in some cases, animals were excommunicated, banished, or executed. For example, in 1474 in Basel, a rooster was tried for laying an egg, an act deemed supernatural and tied to witchcraft, and was burned at the stake after a public trial. This practice, absurd today, reflected the importance of maintaining social order in communities where every resource was vital, and animal damage could threaten entire families' survival. Death, ever present in a world marked by wars, plagues, famines, diseases, and limited medicine, profoundly shaped medieval culture. The Dance of Death, Danse Macabre, a popular allegory in late medieval art, literature, and theater, depicted death as a skeleton or hooded figure leading rich, poor, nobles, peasants, clerics, kings, women, and children alike, reminding everyone of their inevitable fate. This image, appearing in frescoes, engravings, poems, and mystery plays performed in town squares, lives on in our fascination with the macabre, from depictions of the Grim Reaper to modern horror films like Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal, which recreates this allegory. A curious fact: in some medieval cemeteries, especially in crowded cities, ossuaries, or bone houses, were built to store remains when space ran out. These ossuaries, like those at Santa Maria in Lisbon, Sedlec in the modern Czech Republic, or the Paris catacombs, were decorated with skulls and bones, creating a practical yet macabre effect that attracted the faithful, served as a reminder of mortality, and reinforced religious devotion. In some funerals, especially among nobles and wealthy families, professional mourners were hired to weep dramatically, ensuring an emotional farewell, a custom still seen in some traditional Mediterranean, African, and Latin American cultures. This relationship with death, feared, accepted, and ritualized as part of life, left a legacy in our culture, from Gothic skulls and skeletons to celebrations like Mexico's Day of the Dead, blending the solemn with the festive in a tradition with medieval echoes. If you're enjoying this dive into the Middle Ages, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more historical content with a touch of humor. To keep exploring, let's delve into lesser-known aspects of medieval life that also left their mark. Fairs and markets, for example, were the economic and social heart of many communities, where goods were traded, news exchanged, and festivities celebrated. At major fairs, like those in Champagne, France, or Bruges, Flanders, merchants from across Europe traded spices, fabrics, weapons, books, and even relics, while minstrels, acrobats, and preachers entertained the crowds. A curious fact: at some fairs, courts of love were held, where troubadours and ladies debated romantic dilemmas, like whether it was better to love in secret or declare love openly, blending poetry, theater, and philosophy. These fairs not only boosted trade but also laid the groundwork for modern capitalism, with the use of bills of exchange, a precursor to checks, allowing merchants to conduct transactions without carrying large amounts of coin. Women's education, though limited compared to men's, wasn't non-existent. While universities were reserved for men, noble and bourgeois women could be educated in convents, courts, or at home, learning to read, write, manage estates, sew, embroider, and, in some cases, play instruments, or compose poetry. Figures like Christine de Pizan, a 14th century writer, show that women could achieve high erudition. Her work The City of Ladies is a feminist manifesto defending women's value in a male-dominated world. A curious fact: in some convents, nuns wrote and decorated manuscripts, and their works, like those of Hildegard of Bingen, show artistic and literary talent comparable to that of monks. Medieval technology, though less advanced than today's, had its moments of glory. Beyond water and windmills, medieval people developed mechanical clocks, appearing in the 13th century in churches and monasteries to regulate prayer hours. These clocks, though imprecise, were engineering marvels, with gears and weights anticipating modern clock technology. A curious fact: the earliest known mechanical clock, installed in Salisbury Cathedral in 1386, still survives, though restored, and is a testament to the era's technical creativity. In agriculture, the use of horseshoes and padded collars for horses increased field work efficiency, while irrigation systems, like those in Cistercian monasteries, maximized water use. Medieval festivities, beyond carnival, were moments of community and celebration. Harvest festivals, like those of St. John or All Saints, blended pagan and Christian rituals, with bonfires, dances, and feasts strengthening social bonds. A curious fact: in some regions, peasant tournaments were held, where villagers imitated knights' justs with sticks and makeshift shields, often ending in laughter but also bruises. These festivities show that, despite hardships, medieval life had moments of joy and creativity. In conclusion, the Middle Ages weren't just an era of darkness, violence, or ignorance, as often portrayed, but a crucible of myths, realities, contradictions, and achievements that have shaped our world in ways we scarcely realize. From superstitions like knocking on wood or fearing the number 13 to stories of dragons, knights, and witches that inspire modern sagas, this period lives on in our culture, expressions, traditions, and imagination. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to keep exploring history with a touch of fun. By unraveling these myths and curiosities, we not only better understand the past but also see how its echoes resonate in our present, reminding us that, despite the centuries, we remain heirs to that medieval world full of wonders, mistakes, ingenuity, and humanity.